I've been playing the recently released Resident Evil Requiem, and I'm absolutely in love with it. Requiem feels to me like the culmination of everything Resident Evil has been building over the last 30 years. It's a bold product formed of each individual lesson they've learned, the combination of every triumph and every failure of their past. This experience has left me reflecting about those said failures, and the unfortunate state series publisher Capcom found themselves in not all that long ago. It was just around 10 years ago that they were a punching bag, commonly referred to as Crapcom due to the worsening quality of their games. But fast forward to 2026, and they are now one of the most consistent AAA publishers out there. Today, I want to look back through that history and figure out how they were able to turn things around so significantly and what notes other companies could take. Capcom as we know it today was founded in 1983 and would quickly establish itself as a major player in the video game market. More specifically, they really made a name for themselves on the Nintendo Entertainment System. With classic games like Ghosts 'n Goblins, Bionic Commando, and Mega Man, Capcom became a household name for NES owners. They even made great licensed games, such as their iconic Disney line with DuckTales, Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers, and many more. It's important to point this out because it was an era in the gaming industry when many consumers were wary of who they could trust, at least in the North American market. With the lack of quality control we saw on consoles like the Atari 2600, people had become understandably gun-shy about what games were worthy of spending money on. This is why the iconic Nintendo seal of quality became such a big selling point. And similarly to Nintendo, Capcom started to become a logo gamers could trust as well. They had their hits and misses just like anyone else, of course, but they were able to solidify their status as one of the first premier publishers in the home console space. This continued into the Super Nintendo era with Street Fighter and Mega Man X. Once the 3D revolution came around, Capcom stayed strong with Resident Evil and Dino Crisis. In the early 2000s, their pedigree reached a new level with Resident Evil 4, one of the highest rated video games of all time. Over their first 20 years, Capcom was one of the most respected third-party publishers in the world, and it was starting to feel like they could do no wrong. A gaming industry without a soaring Capcom seemed impossible to imagine. That is until it didn't have to be imagined after all. As we entered the 2010s, things started to take a turn. Capcom had lost many of their most fundamental and influential figures within the company. Director of the original Resident Evil and survival horror aficionado Shinji Mikami left in 2006. That same year, the director of Devil May Cry, Beautiful Joe, and Okami, Hideki Kamiya, left as well. Just when you thought things couldn't get much worse, Keiji Inafune, creator of Mega Man and face of Capcom, announced he would also be leaving just a few years later. With highly regarded internal studios like Clover disbanded, the shepherds of their top franchises gone, and countless in-development projects cancelled or stuck in limbo, it wasn't clear who Capcom even was anymore, and that uncertainty started to show within their games. From roughly 2010 to 2016, it just seemed Capcom couldn't get a whole lot going for themselves. Much of what they put out would fall into the 6 out of 10 or 7 out of 10 range, a huge fall from grace when compared to the highs they had experienced a generation prior. Games like the Bionic Commando reimagining, Dark Void, or Remember Me all received middling scores. Meanwhile, Capcom was struggling to support and evolve their established IPs. Whether it was sequels that missed the mark like Dead Rising 4, bad launches such as Street Fighter V, or new takes on established games that angered hardcore fans like the DMC reboot, it felt like they were often taking one step forward and 2 steps back. I think it's also worth noting that the PS3 and 360 era saw a pretty weird trend against Japanese games in general. If you go back and look at the way a lot of Western media outlets talked about them, it's pretty shocking. So while it is true that many of Capcom's games were not as great as they used to be, I also think a lot of the stuff coming from Japan at this time was judged pretty harshly. There's a lot more to say about this phenomenon, but I'll leave it at that for now. I wanted to mention this though because while Capcom's quality was certainly slipping, I do think this cultural shift was exacerbating the problem, making their games even less appealing in a time when they were already struggling. And by the way, it's not to say Capcom didn't make any good games or find any success during this time. That would simply be untrue. Monster Hunter was killing it on 3DS, especially in Japan, but for the most part, their games were falling flat far more often than ever before. And as if the lessening quality of their games or anti-Japanese media sentiment wasn't enough to turn off players, they also started to implement some really questionable business practices as well, such as the infamous Street Fighter X Tekken DLC controversy, a breaking point for many. For those unaware, it was found that the game featured content already on the disc at launch being labeled as DLC. That meant the content could not be accessed without paying extra for it, even though it was already there from day one. Admittedly, when compared to the live service hellscape that is our current gaming ecosystem, that whole story doesn't even really sound all that bad, but at the time it was that bad, and it was a huge source of anger in an already rough point of the company's history. A few years earlier, Capcom probably could have gotten away with something like this, with gamers too enamored to care, but with their new, less favorable view, they didn't have that same runway to work with. Capcom's reputation was in the gutter, and were now often mockingly referred to as Crapcom. All of these failed games and negative press culminated into the major release we need to highlight for this story. The game when everything started to change, Resident Evil 6. RE6 is an extremely well-known game for all the wrong reasons. It's the lowest rated mainline entry in the historic franchise, and is considered the worst by most fans. The Resident Evil series had been creeping closer and closer to full-on action, and with RE6, they went all the way, a change that left most longing for its survival horror roots. Even if you put the large genre departure to the side, it's just not that great in general, at least in my opinion. The multiple campaign structure left stories feeling rushed and dissatisfying. Frequent annoying gimmicks broke up the fun, and an over-reliance on 2010's gaming tropes like QuickTime events have aged terribly. I don't think I need to rip into this game anymore, you've probably already heard it 1,000 times. There's a far more interesting part of the story that I don't see brought up nearly as much, which is that despite all the hate and negativity Resident Evil 6 got, it was still a massive commercial success. Capcom announced the game had sold nearly 5 million copies by March 2013, just 4 months after its initial launch. And thanks to various future re-releases, RE6 was able to top 15 million total units sold. That's a pretty staggering number, and one that most companies would value above all else. The negative review scores or fan outrage would all be tossed to the side because, hey, look how much money we made. There was no immediate commercial incentive to not just continue down this path. But in an unusual twist of fate that we rarely see from a AAA gaming company, Capcom wasn't just focused on the dollar signs. They knew something was wrong. Resident Evil might be making money now, but this was not going to be sustainable. Scorning your community in the pursuit of short-term profit was only going to get you so far. The Capcom name had already lost so much of its prestige, they could not risk the future of their premier franchise as well. And so, Capcom went back to the drawing board and put together a new plan for not just Resident Evil, but their entire catalog as a whole. From the outside looking in, it may initially appear as though Capcom didn't do much of anything different. One day their games just kinda randomly started being great again. But in the background, Capcom had made some major changes to right the ship. It began publicly in 2013, with Capcom stating in their financial report that they would be moving away from outsourced development. This was a business practice they leaned on heavily throughout the Crapcom era, frequently publishing projects made by external studios. It was a large departure for the company, and if I had to guess, it was done for two main reasons. The first was what we mentioned earlier. They had lost a lot of their internal leaders and were unsure of their future direction. The second was that they were trying to appeal more to Western audiences and felt working with developers from outside Japan could aid them them in that goal. But this initiative did not go the way they planned, and was a major reason for their brand deterioration. With that said though, blaming it all on their external partners would be a cop-out. As we just mentioned, plenty of Capcom's internal projects were rough too. Fans at the time felt this blame of external partners was Capcom's way of avoiding responsibility, but as it turns out, they had a plan to address their own output as well. All the way back in 2011, Capcom had begun development on a new state-of-the-art engine for their games. It was initially supposed to debut alongside their next-generation PlayStation 4 title called Deep Down. Unfortunately, that project didn't come together and was eventually cancelled. However, their engine work proved extremely promising, and would instead make its first appearance with a very important title, the next mainline Resident Evil. It had been 5 years since the backlash of RE6 and its over-reliance on action. It was unclear what the future of the franchise would look like, and many fans worried about its next chapter. But Resident Evil 7's chilling reveal trailer showed Capcom knew exactly what time it was. A lot would be changing with this new installment. It would be the first game created with the new RE engine, and it would be the first mainline Resident Evil title to be in first person. But there was one thing that wouldn't be so new: its return to survival horror. In North America, the game's full title would be Resident Evil 7 Biohazard, a nod to the franchise's Japanese name. And this ode to its Japanese roots was more than just a cute reference. It was a strong proclamation that Resident Evil was back. No more trying to morph this series into a Gears of War style action romp that they thought Western audiences would like. They were going to make the game their core community had been dreaming of. Upon release, RE7 was met with unanimous praise for its horror elements, new perspective, and upgraded engine. The game was slow-paced, prioritizing survivability and ammo management over high-octane action. It had methodical puzzles that left you wondering, how do people normally get in here? It was everything Capcom once thought Resident Evil couldn't be in the modern era, and yet they were finding more success than ever. RE7 was the best-selling game in the United States in its launch month of January 2017, and the title would go on to reach over 16 million copies sold, making it one of Capcom's most popular games ever. Resident Evil 7's success, both commercially and critically, seemed to set off a light bulb within Capcom. For so many years, they had tried to be something they weren't, something they thought the market wanted, and yet it was this game that got them back on track. Not a game that emulated the gameplay of popular Western titles, not a game that attempted to modernize a legacy IP, but a game that went back to their roots. It was a lesson to trust themselves and trust in the way they make games. This epiphany kicked off the next decade of excellence we've seen, with a run so consistently incredible that Crapcom has become nothing more than a distant memory. In the coming years, all of Capcom's major projects would adopt the RE engine, a sign of its brilliance. Building an engine that can support so many different styles of games and genres is extremely impressive, and I feel having such a strong unified tool to work with is a big reason why they found so much sustained success. Alongside their great engine came the renewed confidence in themselves that has led to a renaissance the likes of which we might never see again. Basically, every IP that Capcom has supported over the last 10 years finds itself in a better position than it was back then. Street Fighter 6 received rave reviews and has reached 6 million units sold, outpacing its predecessor. Devil May Cry dumped the failed reboot and made its triumphant return with its 5th numbered entry. DMC5, which is widely considered one of the top action games of all time, became the best-selling game in the series with over 10 million copies sold. Monster Hunter continued its rise to the top with Wilds, shipping over 8 million units in just 3 days, becoming Capcom's fastest-selling title in their storied history. In January 2026, it was reported that Capcom achieved record software sales across their entire catalog, selling more cumulative units in a 9-month period than they ever had previously. Even more incredibly, that historic milestone came before their most recent smash hit reached the market. Resident Evil Requiem, which has received early Game of the Year hype, was recently crowned the fastest selling title in its franchise history. With new IPs like Pragmata on the way, and other historic franchises like Onimusha, Mega Man, and Okami set to make their returns, Capcom shows no signs of slowing down, and their fans have no reason to expect anything less than greatness from these upcoming releases. For the first time in quite a while, that blue and yellow logo stands for something. For a whole new generation, it represents that same stamp of quality that NES gamers came to recognize all those years ago. Capcom are in a stronger position than ever, not because they chased trends, but because they put their heads down and invested in the refinement of their titles. As a big fan of Capcom's franchises, but also as a fan of video games in general, it has made me extremely happy to see them able to turn things around so significantly. And it is my sincere hope that other AAA publishers are paying attention. In an era where so many companies are literally burning hundreds of millions of dollars in their desperate pursuit of big-time hits, Capcom is steadily trucking along in their own lane, and doing better than most. I'm not saying every game needs to be made with the design philosophy of a Japanese game developer from the 80s, and it's not even necessarily about avoiding live service or multiplayer, because Monster Hunter is a huge success in that genre. When I say other teams need to learn from this, I mean it in terms of prioritizing quality over everything else. So many games nowadays get made with goals of optimizing monetization and engagement before they are even done cooking, more concerned with how to get people spending than if they are even having fun in the first place. What Capcom's catalog shows is that if you put time, effort, and love into your products, the profit will come. You don't need to look and play like everyone else to top the charts. The sooner more companies realize that, the sooner we can see more awesome stories like Capcom's in the AAA space.